Every empire remembers its conquerors. Every battlefield remembers its dead. But the kingdom of Valadorn remembered something far more dangerous than either. It remembered the silence that fell across entire provinces whenever Duke Cedric Ravengard entered a room. Not the silence of reverence, not even the silence of fear. The silence of absolute biological certainty that the man standing before you had already decided whether you would survive this conversation. Some men earned loyalty through kindness, some through gold. Cedric earned it the only way that lasted, by making the alternative to loyalty so catastrophic that no rational mind would consider it. Stay with this story until the very end. You will understand why. The Winter Sovereign Ball arrived the way all traditions arrived in Valadorn, draped in ceremony that existed solely to remind every noble family exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of survival. Blackmoor Citadel consumed the northern cliffs like something geological rather than architectural, its obsidian towers stabbing upward through perpetual storm clouds, while ice winds screamed across battlements that had watched 3 dynasties collapse beneath their shadow. Inside those walls, 1,000 candles burned behind cathedral glass, throwing fractured gold across marble floors polished by centuries of aristocratic boots. Cedric stood at the far end of the grand hall, watching the spectacle unfold with the detached precision of a man cataloging threats rather than enjoying festivities. He wore black. He always wore black. Not because it suited him, though it carved his silhouette into something blade-sharp against the candlelight, but because color was a performance, and Cedric Ravengard had stopped performing for anyone the night his father's blood dried on the floor of this exact room 14 years ago. Lord Aldrin Carvas approached with 2 goblets of Miravel wine and a smile engineered to convey warmth. He was the kind of nobleman who survived regime changes the way cockroaches survived winters, by scuttling into darkness until the killing stopped. Your Grace, the evening surpasses itself. The musicians alone must have cost a fortune. He extended 1 goblet toward the Duke. Cedric did not take it. The musicians cost exactly what I decided they would cost, Carvas, which is considerably less than the amount your son lost gambling in the Harbor District last Tuesday. His voice carried no malice. It carried something worse, total awareness. 4,700 sovereign marks in a single evening. Impressive, given that your family's entire quarterly revenue barely reaches 12,000. The color drained from Carvas's face in real time. Your Grace, I was not aware you kept such detailed... You were not aware because awareness requires intelligence. Your son has neither. Withdraw him from the capital before the end of the month. If I hear his name connected to another scandal that reflects poorly on the families under my governance, I will dissolve your trade charter and redistribute your eastern holdings to House Veridane. Cedric finally looked at him. Gray eyes, cold as surgical instruments. Do you need me to repeat any of that, or did the threat register adequately the first time? Carvas managed something that resembled a bow and retreated so quickly his wine spilled across the marble. General Hadrian Volk materialized from the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 30 years reading battlefields. Tall, iron-haired, built like siege architecture given human form, Hadrian served as both military commander and the closest thing Cedric possessed to an honest voice. He had served the previous duke. He had watched the previous duke die. And he had chosen to serve the son because he recognized in those gray eyes something that transcended hereditary power, the absolute refusal to be destroyed by anything, including grief. You enjoy that? Hadrian said flatly, falling into step beside the Duke as they moved along the perimeter of the hall. Define that. Terrifying minor lords until they forget how to swallow. Cedric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I enjoy efficiency. Carvas's son is hemorrhaging family resources into gambling dens controlled by merchant guilds that answer to Cassian Merivale. Every sovereign mark that boy loses strengthens a network designed to undermine Ravengard influence in the harbor districts. I did not threaten Carvas. I removed a vulnerability. Hadrian studied his duke the way a physician studies a wound that refuses to heal. 28 years old and already governing with the cold calculation of a man 3 decades older. The kingdom saw ruthlessness. Hadrian saw something more complex, a mind that processed the world exclusively through the lens of threat and survival, because it had never been shown any other way to exist. The Viremont girl arrives within the hour, Hadrian said, changing the subject with the delicacy of someone handling live ordnance. Cedric stopped walking. The Grand Hall continued its performance around them. Laughter, music, crystal meeting crystal in manufactured celebration. But the stillness that settled over the Duke created a pocket of gravity that nearby courtiers instinctively avoided. She was supposed to arrive 3 hours ago. Her carriage was delayed at the eastern checkpoint. Commander Brielle reports she refused the military escort and insisted on traveling with a single attendant. Refused. Her exact words, according to Brielle, were, "I do not require an armed procession to remind me that I am being collected like cargo." For the first time that evening, something moved behind Cedric's expression. Not amusement, not anger. Something closer to recognition. The way a predator's ears rotate toward an unexpected sound in a forest it considered thoroughly mapped. Lady Celine Viermont was the last surviving member of House Viermont, a noble family that had been powerful enough to rival Ravengard influence until Celine's father, Lord Edric Viermont, made the catastrophic decision to join a failed coup against Cedric's rule 2 years prior. The coup collapsed in 11 days. Lord Edric's execution followed in 3. His estates were seized, his name was struck from aristocratic registers, his wife died of fever in a relocation camp before winter ended, and his daughter, 22 years old, educated at the finest academies on the continent, fluent in 4 languages and trained in political strategy by her father himself, became a ward of the state, which in Valadorn meant a ward of Cedric Ravengard. The political rationale was clean. By absorbing the last Viremont into Ravengard's household, Cedric neutralized any future claim her bloodline might leverage against him, while simultaneously demonstrating to rival houses that even total destruction could be followed by conditional mercy. It was governance operating at the level of surgical theater, precise, public, and designed to make every noble family in the kingdom recalculate their ambitions. But rational explanations never told the complete story, and Cedric had learned long ago that the most dangerous truths were the ones hiding behind perfectly logical justifications. The Grand Hall doors opened at 23 minutes past midnight. Every conversation within 40 feet died simultaneously. Celine Viermont entered Blackmoor Citadel wearing silver silk that caught candlelight like water-catching moonlight, not designed to seduce but to announce. Her dark hair was pulled back with brutal severity, exposing the architecture of a face built for confrontation rather than decoration. High cheekbones, a mouth that seemed engineered for delivering verdicts, and eyes, dark amber, almost bronze, that swept the Grand Hall with the systematic precision of someone identifying exits, threats, and allies in that exact order. She walked alone. No attendant, no escort, no concession to the protocol that demanded arriving wards present themselves with visible deference to their guardian's household. Every aristocrat in the room understood the calculation happening behind those amber eyes. The Viermont girl was not entering Blackmoor Citadel. She was entering a war zone, and she had chosen to arrive unarmed because weaponlessness itself was a weapon when wielded correctly. It forced the enemy to reveal their own arsenal first. Cedric descended 3 steps from the elevated platform where he had been standing and crossed the marble floor toward her. The crowd parted for him the way water parts for something displacing it through sheer mass. He stopped exactly 5 feet from Celine, close enough to establish dominance, distant enough to deny her the intimacy of proximity. "Lady Viermont," his voice carried across the silent hall without effort. "You are 3 hours late to a function held in your honor." "In my honor." She repeated the phrase as though dissecting it for structural flaws. Her voice was lower than expected, controlled, textured, stripped of the artificial sweetness most noble women deployed like perfume. "I was unaware that transferring custody required celebration. Everything in Valadorn requires ceremony. Ceremony establishes order. Order prevents the kind of catastrophic miscalculation that destroyed your father's house." The silence in the Grand Hall became physical. Courtiers stopped breathing. Servants froze mid-stride. Even the musicians faltered before recovering their rhythm. Celine's expression did not change. Not a flinch. Not a flicker. My father's house was destroyed because he trusted men who lacked the courage to follow through on their convictions. That is not a miscalculation, Your Grace. That is a lesson in choosing allies more carefully. She held his gaze with absolute steadiness. A lesson I suspect you learned long before he did. The implication hung in the air like smoke. She was not defending her father's rebellion. She was acknowledging its failure while simultaneously demonstrating that she understood its mechanics better than anyone in this room, including the man who crushed it. Kadric studied her for 4 full seconds. In the economy of power, 4 seconds of silent evaluation from the Duke of Ravengard was the equivalent of a drawn blade. Then he extended his hand. Not warmly, not graciously. The gesture carried the weight of ownership rather than welcome, and every person watching understood the distinction. Celine looked at that hand the way a chess player looks at a board where every piece has been repositioned during their absence. She took it, and the entire court exhaled. The weeks that followed rewrote Celine's understanding of captivity. Blackmoor Citadel was not a prison. Prisons had the decency to announce themselves honestly. This place operated through subtler architecture. Freedom that existed only within boundaries so precisely calibrated that testing them felt more dangerous than accepting them. She was given chambers in the Eastern Tower, furnished with obsessive luxury that felt less like generosity and more like surveillance dressed in silk. She was granted access to the Citadel Library, the gardens, the inner courtyards. She was permitted to take meals wherever she chose and speak to whomever she wished. But she noticed the patterns. Servants who appeared at exactly the same intervals, regardless of her location. Guards whose patrol routes adjusted whenever she deviated from expected pathways. Correspondence that arrived already opened, resealed with craftsmanship so meticulous that most people would never detect the tampering. Celine detected it within 4 days. She said nothing. Understanding the shape of your cage was the first requirement for surviving inside it. The second requirement was patience. The third was making the cage believe it contained something too valuable to destroy. Kadric summoned her to the War Council chamber on her 9th morning at Blackmoor. The room occupied the Citadel's central tower, circular, stone-walled, dominated by a tactical map of Valadorn that covered an entire oak table carved from a single ancient tree. Miniature figures representing military assets, trade routes, and noble house territories covered its surface like a 3-dimensional argument about who controlled what. 6 men sat around that table, military commanders, economic advisors, intelligence operatives, the kind of men who measured human life in strategic utility and slept soundly afterward. Celine entered and found no chair prepared for her. Kadric sat at the head of the table reviewing dispatches. He did not look up. Lady Viermont, you studied economic theory at the Alderain Academy under Professor Maelis, who was considered the foremost authority on trade network vulnerabilities in the eastern provinces. Tell me what you observe about the current grain distribution across the southern territories. No greeting, no context. A test detonated without warning to measure how the target responded under pressure. Every man at that table shifted their attention to Celine with expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly concealed contempt. General Hadrian leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, watching the Duke rather than the girl, reading the subtext beneath the interrogation. Celine walked to the tactical map. She studied it for approximately 40 seconds. Your grain shipments through the Varenthal corridor are being systematically delayed at the Thornmark checkpoint by officials receiving supplementary payments from merchant guilds operating under House Miravail's protection. The delays create artificial scarcity in the southern provinces, which inflates local grain prices by roughly 30%. That inflation redirects consumer spending away from Ravengard-taxed markets and toward unregulated black market suppliers. The net effect is approximately 9,000 sovereign marks per month in lost tax revenue and a gradual erosion of public confidence in Ravengard governance across 4 southern districts. She traced a line across the map with one finger. Additionally, the officials processing the delays are falsifying checkpoint logs to show weather-related disruptions rather than administrative holds, which means whoever designed this scheme understood that your intelligence network monitors trade data but relies heavily on checkpoint documentation as primary source material. She looked at the Duke. Your information architecture has a single point of failure, and someone is exploiting it. The War Council chamber went silent. Lord Marchfeld, the senior economic advisor, turned the color of old brick. His jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak. Your Grace, the Southern grain situation has been thoroughly reviewed by my department, and we have found no evidence of Marchfeld. Kadrick's voice landed on the name like a guillotine blade meeting wood. She identified the flaw in 9 days that your department missed in 6 months. Either your analysts are incompetent or they are compromised. I want a full audit of every Southern checkpoint officer on my desk by tomorrow morning. If I discover that anyone within your division was aware of this exploitation and failed to report it, the consequences will extend beyond professional termination. He stood. The room flinched. Lady Viremont will attend all future council sessions. Prepare an additional seat. Celine's face revealed nothing, but something rearranged itself behind those amber eyes. The recognition that survival inside Blackmoor Citadel had just shifted from endurance to engagement. She was no longer a prisoner being observed. She was a weapon being evaluated for deployment. Whether that was better or worse remained entirely unclear. Weeks turned into a strange routine that operated on its own savage logic. Kadrick placed Celine beside him at state dinners, where rival nobles performed elaborate dances of loyalty while calculating betrayal behind crystal wine glasses. He positioned her at negotiations with foreign ambassadors, who arrived expecting to face a solitary tyrant and found instead a dual architecture of power that disoriented their prepared strategies. He watched her absorb information the way fire absorbs oxygen, silently, completely, transforming everything it consumed into something more volatile. The court began adjusting its behavior around her presence with the unconscious precision of organisms adapting to a new predator in their ecosystem. Duchess Kalara Montford, the widow of a northern lord and the most politically connected woman in Valadorn, cornered Celine during a diplomatic reception in the Citadel's East Gallery. Kalara was 63 years old and had survived 4 regime changes through a combination of strategic marriages, selective intelligence distribution, and an instinct for self-preservation so refined it bordered on precognition. You fascinate him, Kalara said without preamble, handing Celine a glass of wine she had not requested. That should terrify you considerably more than it apparently does. Celine accepted the glass. Fascination is a negotiable commodity. Fear is not. How philosophical for someone living inside a cage designed by the man who executed her father. My father designed his own execution the moment he chose allies incapable of matching his ambition. The cage I occupy was built by circumstance. The question is whether circumstance can be renegotiated. Kalara studied her with the sharp approval of one survivor recognizing another. You sound like him. Has that occurred to you yet, that you are beginning to think the way he thinks? I've always thought this way, Duchess. The difference is that before Blackmoor, I had no reason to let anyone see it. That conversation lingered inside Celine's mind long after the reception ended. She stood at the window of her tower chamber watching ice rain hammer the citadel walls and considered the woman she was becoming inside these corridors. Every day she spent in proximity to Caedric Ravengard taught her something about the mechanics of dominance that no academy lecture had ever approached. Not the theory, the texture, the way power smelled when it entered a room, like cold metal and burnt cedar. The way it altered the molecular structure of conversations, bending language toward obedience the way gravity bends light. She was learning things about herself that had been dormant for 22 years. Whether those things should remain dormant was a question she increasingly avoided answering. Lord Cassian Miravail arrived at Blackmoor Citadel in late January with 50 mounted soldiers and the easy smile of a man who believed his own propaganda. Commander of the Crown Guard and cousin to the increasingly irrelevant king, Cassian embodied everything Caedric despised about hereditary authority. Power inherited rather than earned, wielded as decoration rather than instrument, maintained through charm rather than competence. He was also, by every intelligence report Caedric possessed, the most dangerous man in Valadorn after the Duke himself. The formal reception took place in the Obsidian Receiving Hall, a chamber deliberately designed to make visitors feel geologically insignificant. Black stone columns rose 40 feet toward a vaulted ceiling where wrought iron chandeliers hung like mechanical constellations. The acoustics transformed whispers into echoes and echoes into accusations. Cassian entered wearing the ceremonial white of the crown guard with gold epaulets that caught torchlight like small detonations. Handsome, mid-30s, built with the athletic ease of someone who trained for appearance rather than necessity. His eyes moved across the hall with practiced warmth, cataloging faces and manufacturing connection with the efficiency of a man who understood that likability was a currency far cheaper to produce than fear. Duke Ravengard. He bowed with exactly the degree of depth that acknowledged authority without conceding superiority. Blackmoor never fails to remind its visitors of their mortality. I assume that is intentional. Everything in this citadel is intentional, Miravail, including your invitation, which I was delighted to accept. The crown has long wished for closer relations with House Ravengard. These are turbulent times. Unity serves everyone. Unity. Cadric repeated the word the way a chemist repeats the name of an unstable compound. You have spent the last 8 months consolidating alliances with 5 noble houses that share a border with my eastern territories. You replaced the garrison commanders at Thornmark and Varenthal with officers loyal to your family rather than the crown. And your agents have been distributing pamphlets in the southern provinces suggesting that Ravengard taxation constitutes economic tyranny. He paused. Explain to me which component of that activity you consider unity. The warmth in Cassian's expression did not falter. That alone confirmed everything Cadric suspected about him. A man who could absorb accusations of treasonous activity without flinching possessed either genuine innocence or practiced ruthlessness indistinguishable from it. Your Grace, provincial politics generate rumors the way thunderstorms generate lightning, constantly, indiscriminately, and with very little regard for accuracy. I am a servant of the crown. My loyalty extends to the throne and to the stability of Valadorn. If isolated administrative decisions at regional checkpoints have created the impression of competition between our houses, I assure you that impression is entirely unintentional. Unintentional. Cadric stood from his throne and descended the obsidian steps with deliberate slowness. The last man who stood in this hall and assured me his hostile actions were unintentional is currently buried beneath the northern courtyard. His family sends flowers on the anniversary. He stopped 3 feet from Cassian. I do not require your assurance, Miravail. I require your compliance. You will withdraw your officers from Thornmark within 30 days. You will cease communication with houses Aldrin, Corsair, Fenwick, Dalmore, and Greythane regarding any matters related to Eastern territorial governance. And you will present a detailed accounting of Crown Guard expenditures to my Treasury office by month's end. And if the Crown objects to these demands, the Crown is welcome to object. The Crown is also welcome to remember that Ravengard steel keeps this kingdom standing while the royal court debates which color to paint the throne room. Cassian held the Duke's gaze for a long, measured moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that stored information rather than expressed emotion. As you wish, Your Grace. Cooperation is always preferable to conflict. He bowed again and withdrew. General Hadrian appeared at Cadric's shoulder before the receiving hall doors fully closed. He will not comply, Hadrian said, obviously. Then why issue demands you know he will violate? Cadric turned back toward his throne. His expression had shifted into something Hadrian recognized from 14 years of service. The look of a man constructing a trap so comprehensive that the prey would not realize they were inside it until every exit had already been sealed. Because violation requires action, action creates evidence, and evidence transforms suspicion into justification. He sat down. The obsidian throne absorbed his silhouette until man and stone became indistinguishable. Let him conspire, Hadrian. Let him gather his allies and draft his plans and convince himself that numbers equal strength. When the moment arrives, I want the entirety of his network visible. Not fragments, not rumors, the entire architecture. And the Viermont girl? Miravail spent considerable effort studying her during the reception. He sees what you see. Cadric's fingers tightened against the arm of the throne. Miravail sees a vulnerability he can exploit. A disgraced noblewoman inside enemy walls carrying resentment for the man who destroyed her family. He will attempt to recruit her. Will she be receptive? The Duke did not answer immediately. Outside, wind shrieked against the citadel walls with the fury of something trying to dismantle stone through persistence alone. That, Kedrick said quietly, depends entirely on whether she has decided what she is becoming. 3 weeks later, the answer arrived in the most dangerous form possible. Celine was crossing the inner courtyard after a late council session when a sealed letter appeared beneath her chamber door. No sender, no seal, no identifying mark of any kind. Inside, written in cipher she recognized immediately from her father's personal correspondence system, were 4 sentences that detonated her entire understanding of the world she was navigating. The Crown Guard moves against Raven Guard before spring. Your father's network survives underground. You are not forgotten. Choose carefully. Celine stood in her chamber holding the letter while winter moonlight turned the parchment silver. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her mind was not. Everything she had built inside Blackmore, every careful alliance, every calculated display of competence, every night spent learning the architecture of Caedric Ravengard's power, balanced on the edge of a single decision that would determine whether she emerged from the citadel as a duchess or a traitor. And somewhere in the frozen darkness beyond the walls, forces that wanted the Duke dead were waiting for her answer. Celine burned the letter at 3 minutes past midnight. She held it over the candle flame on her writing desk and watched the cipher dissolve into black curling ash, each word consuming itself in reverse order until the parchment became nothing. No evidence, no fingerprints, no proof that the dead could still reach through the walls of Blackmore Citadel and ask their daughter to finish what they started. The ash settled on the desk like gray snow. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window glass. Bronze eyes, steady mouth. The face of a woman standing at the exact intersection where loyalty and vengeance occupied the same coordinates, and the only difference between them was which direction you were facing when you pulled the trigger. She did not sleep that night. By morning, she had made no decision. And the absence of decision was itself the most dangerous position she could occupy. Because in Blackmore Citadel, neutrality was a luxury that decomposed faster than fresh meat in summer heat. Kedrick noticed. He noticed everything. That was the fundamental horror of existing inside his proximity. The man's attention operated like a weather system, invisible and omnipresent, exerting pressure on everything within its radius without requiring direct contact. She arrived at the morning council session 11 seconds later than her usual time, and his eyes tracked her entrance with the fractional adjustment of someone recalibrating a measurement that had shifted by a single degree. He said nothing about it. That was worse. The council session concerned military deployments along the eastern border, where 3 of Cassian Miravail's allied houses had begun conducting joint cavalry exercises that technically violated no treaty but communicated hostile intent with the subtlety of a loaded crossbow aimed at someone's dining room window. General Hadrian spread reconnaissance reports across the oak table, while commanders argued about response protocols with the controlled aggression of men who understood that the wrong recommendation could end careers or lives with equal ease. Celine sat in her designated chair, the one Caedric had ordered installed 3 weeks ago, positioned at his right hand where every person entering the chamber would register her presence before they registered anything else, and absorbed information the way she always absorbed information, silently, completely. Filing connections between data points that the men around this table either missed or deliberately ignored. But today, her mind operated on 2 parallel tracks. One track processed the military intelligence with genuine analytical precision. The other track replayed 4 sentences written in her dead father's cipher and calculated the implications with a ruthlessness that would have made Kedrick himself pause. The Crown Guard moves against Raven Guard before spring. She knew what that meant. Cassian Miravail was not merely consolidating political alliances. He was building a war machine disguised as administrative reform, positioning assets across the kingdom with the patient methodology of someone who understood that overthrowing a man like Caedric Ravengard required not superior force, but superior architecture. The right pieces in the right positions activated at the right moment to collapse the entire structure before its architect could respond. Your father's network survives underground. That was the sentence that burned, not because it surprised her. She had suspected for months that fragments of House Viramont's intelligence apparatus persisted in the shadows, maintained by loyalists too deeply embedded to be identified during Caedric's purge. What burned was the implication beneath the words. Someone with access to that network had identified her location, penetrated Blackmore Citadel's security perimeter, and delivered a message to her private chamber without detection, which meant either the Citadel's defenses contained gaps that Kaedric's people had not discovered, or someone inside the Citadel itself was connected to forces working against the Duke. Either possibility was explosive. Lady Viremont. Kaedric's voice severed both tracks of thought with surgical precision. She looked up. Every commander at the table was staring at her. The room had the particular silence of men waiting for someone to answer a question she had not heard asked. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was considering the logistics of the Thornmark repositioning." A lie delivered with flawless composure. She watched it land across Kaedric's expression and felt the atmospheric pressure in the room shift by several degrees as he evaluated whether to accept it. "I asked whether your father ever discussed House Miravail's military infrastructure with you during your education." The question detonated silently inside her chest, not because of what it asked, but because of what it revealed. Kaedric was thinking about her father, about the Viremont intelligence network, about whether the daughter sitting at his right hand possessed knowledge inherited from the man he executed. She met his eyes without flinching. "My father discussed military infrastructure the way most fathers discuss weather, constantly, comprehensively, and with the assumption that his audience was paying attention." She paused long enough for the weight to settle. "Miraval maintains a secondary command structure operating independently of the Crown Guard's official chain. Ghost companies. Roughly 600 soldiers distributed across civilian populations in the eastern provinces, funded through commercial front operations that your treasury audits would classify as legitimate merchant enterprises. They have been dormant since before my father's death. If Miraval is activating Eastern alliances, those companies will mobilize first." The War Council chamber went very still. General Hadrian leaned forward. 600 is a significant number to hide inside civilian infrastructure. How confident are you in that figure?" "My father was many things, General. Inaccurate was never one of them." Kaedric studied her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Hadrian. "Redeploy the 4th and 7th reconnaissance units to eastern civilian centers. Focus on commercial properties acquired within the last 4 years that show revenue patterns inconsistent with their stated business models. I want every ghost company identified and cataloged within 60 days." The session continued for another hour, but the gravitational center of the room had permanently shifted. Celine had delivered intelligence that validated her strategic value, while simultaneously revealing the depth of knowledge she possessed about networks designed to destroy the very man she was serving. Every commander at that table understood the paradox. The woman who just strengthened Ravenguard's defensive posture was the daughter of a man who died trying to demolish it. Kaedric understood it most clearly of all. He summoned her to his private study that evening. The study occupied the highest room in Blackmore's central tower, a circular chamber lined with maps, military treatises, and correspondence files organized with the obsessive precision of a mind that processed chaos by imposing absolute structural control upon it. A single window overlooked the northern cliffs, where winter storms threw themselves against rock faces with suicidal persistence. The room smelled like ink, leather, and the particular metallic coldness of stone that never fully absorbed warmth. Kaedric stood at the window with his back to the door when she entered. He did not turn around. "Close the door." She closed it. The sound of the latch engaging echoed briefly in the circular stone chamber, and then died. "You gave the council information today that you could have withheld indefinitely. Information that protects a man your father would have celebrated watching die." He turned. Firelight carved his face into something half illuminated and half consumed by shadow. "Why?" "Because the ghost companies threaten the stability of the kingdom regardless of who sits on Blackmore's throne. If Miraval activates 600 embedded soldiers inside civilian populations, the resulting conflict destroys infrastructure, trade networks, and civilian lives that have nothing to do with aristocratic power struggles." She held his gaze. "My father understood that. It was why he structured his intelligence network to identify threats, rather than create them. Your father structured his intelligence network to overthrow me. My father structured his intelligence network to protect Valadorn from what he believed was authoritarian consolidation that would eventually consume the kingdom. He was wrong about many things. He was not wrong about the danger of unchecked power. The air between them compressed. Celine felt it physically, the way proximity to Caedric Ravengard altered the density of the atmosphere, turning ordinary conversation into something that required the same careful navigation as crossing a frozen lake where the ice thickness varied with every step. You are defending him. I am describing him. There is a difference. Caedric crossed the room toward her. Not quickly, not threateningly. With the measured deliberation of a man who understood that physical space carried political meaning and every foot of distance eliminated between them represented a boundary being consciously dissolved. He stopped close enough that she could see the individual striations of gray in his eyes. Not uniform silver, but fractured, like ice that had been broken and refrozen repeatedly until the original structure was impossible to reconstruct. "The letter," he said. Her blood stopped moving. "What letter?" "The one delivered to your chamber last night by someone who penetrated my security perimeter using a service tunnel beneath the eastern kitchens that was sealed 14 years ago and apparently reopened within the last 6 months." His voice remained absolutely level. "I became aware of the breach 7 hours ago when my intelligence chief completed the access audit I ordered after noticing that you arrived at this morning's council session 11 seconds later than your established pattern. 11 seconds of deviation from a woman who has not deviated from any behavioral pattern since entering the citadel." Celine's heartbeat slammed against her ribcage with the force of a war drum. Every survival instinct she possessed fired simultaneously, screaming at her to retreat, to fabricate, to deploy any mechanism of self-preservation available. Instead, she stood still. Because running from Caedric Ravengard was not survival, it was confirmation. "I burned it." "I know. My people recovered ash fragments from your writing desk during today's council session. Insufficient for reconstruction." He paused. "Which means the contents exist only in your memory. And the question of whether you share those contents with me or withhold them determines everything that happens next. To you, to the citadel, to the arrangement we have been constructing since the night you walked into my ballroom and refused to lower your eyes." She breathed. One long, controlled breath that pulled cold air deep into her lungs and held it there while her mind executed calculations at a velocity that felt almost physical. The letter had offered her a path back to the world her father built, a network of loyalists, a conspiracy to destroy the man standing 3 feet in front of her. Revenge served through the architecture of political assassination. And standing in this room, close enough to see the exhaustion hidden beneath Caedric's granite composure, the microscopic evidence of a man who had not slept fully in 14 years because sleeping fully required trusting someone to guard the perimeter while you were vulnerable, she understood something that the letter's authors had not anticipated. She did not want revenge. She wanted something far more dangerous than revenge. She wanted power, not inherited, not stolen, power earned by standing inside the most hostile environment on the continent and proving herself indispensable to its architecture. Destroying Caedric would return her to the margins. Another displaced noblewoman carrying a dead family's name through corridors that no longer recognized its authority. But standing beside him, inside the machinery of Ravengard governance, with her hand on levers that controlled the kingdom's direction, that was not captivity. That was conquest by integration. The letter came from Miravel's network using my father's cipher to establish trust. 4 sentences. The Crown Guard moves against you before spring. My father's intelligence apparatus survives underground. They want me to participate. She delivered the information with the clinical precision of an intelligence briefing, stripped of emotion, stripped of performance. Caedric absorbed it without visible reaction. His eyes moved across her face the way a cartographer's eyes move across terrain, being mapped for the first time, recording elevation, identifying features, calculating distances between landmarks. You chose to tell me. I chose to survive, and survival inside this citadel requires something more reliable than secrecy. She paused. It requires you to understand that I am more valuable as an ally than as a prisoner. You're suggesting I trust you. I am suggesting you recognize that I had the opportunity to betray you and chose not to. In Valadorn, that qualifies as the closest approximation to trust available. The silence that followed consumed approximately 12 seconds. 12 seconds during which Celine felt every cell in her body vibrating at a frequency that matched the fundamental tension between the two of them. Not romantic, not yet, but something raw and more structurally significant. The recognition between two architectures of survival that they were built from the same material. Cadric turned back toward the window. Miravail's timeline accelerates everything. If the Crown Guard mobilizes before spring, we have approximately 7 weeks to identify every node in his network, neutralize his embedded forces, and position military assets for a conflict that will determine whether House Ravengard survives or is dismantled. He paused. You will use your father's cipher to respond to the letter's source. You will accept their offer of alliance. You will provide them with intelligence about Blackmore's defenses. Intelligence that I will personally curate to ensure that every piece of information Miravail receives leads him deeper into a strategic position from which extraction becomes impossible. Celine understood what he was asking. He was asking her to become a double agent operating inside the ruins of her own family's network, feeding disinformation to men who believed they were rescuing the last daughter of House Viermont, while she systematically guided them into a trap designed by the man who murdered her father. The brutality of it was breathtaking. The elegance of it was undeniable. And when this is over, she asked, when Miravail's network is destroyed and the conspiracy is dismantled, what am I then? Cadric looked at her over his shoulder. Firelight carved the angles of his face into something that existed at the exact boundary between human and monument. That depends entirely on what you prove yourself to be between now and then. 3 weeks later, the machinery of deception operated with terrifying efficiency. Celine established contact with her father's underground network through dead-drop locations she reconstructed from memory, locations her father had shown her during childhood visits to the capital, disguised as educational outings, but actually serving as training exercises for a daughter he had always intended to deploy as an intelligence asset. The network's surviving coordinator, a former Viermont steward operating under the alias Thornwell, responded within 72 hours. The exchanges were clinical, tactical, stripped of sentimentality. Thornwell provided names. Celine provided Cadric's curated intelligence, defensive patrol schedules with subtle inaccuracies, garrison strength reports inflated by 15%, supply chain vulnerabilities that appeared genuine but led to fortified positions rather than weak points. Every piece of false intelligence passed through Cadric's hands before Celine transmitted it. He reviewed each item in the tower study late at night, modifying details with the precision of a forger who understood that convincing lies required 95% truth. During those sessions, something shifted between them that neither acknowledged aloud. They worked in physical proximity that dissolved professional distance without replacing it with anything identifiable. His hand brushing hers while passing documents, her shoulder against his arm while they leaned over the same map. Eye contact that lasted 2 seconds longer than strategic coordination required. Cadric's breathing changed when she was close. Celine noticed because noticing was what kept her alive. The rhythm altered, deeper, more controlled, the way a man breathes when he is actively managing a physiological response he refuses to display. She noticed because her own breathing did the same thing, but neither of them spoke about it. Because speaking about it would require acknowledging that the architecture they were constructing together had developed structural elements that transcended political utility, and acknowledging that would introduce a vulnerability that neither of them could afford, while a conspiracy to destroy them both gathered momentum in the darkness beyond Blackmore's walls. General Hadrian watched the entire evolution with the grim resignation of a career soldier observing two volatile chemicals being stored in increasingly close proximity. "This ends badly," he told Cadric during a private briefing in the armory. "Either she is genuine, in which case you are developing an emotional attachment to an asset deployed inside an active intelligence operation, or she is not genuine, in which case every piece of information she has provided is designed to position you exactly where Miravail wants you. Your concern is noted. My concern is not a courtesy, Cadric. It is a tactical assessment from the only person in this citadel who knew you before you became whatever the hell you are now." Hadrian stepped closer. "Your father trusted the wrong person and died on this floor. I watched it happen. I will not watch it happen twice." Kadrick's jaw locked with visible force. My father trusted the wrong person because he confused loyalty with affection. I am not confused about anything. Then why does she attend your private strategic sessions? Why does she have access to intelligence that 3 senior commanders have been denied? Why do you review her communications personally instead of delegating to your intelligence chief? Because she is the most strategically valuable asset I have ever acquired, and strategic assets require direct oversight. Assets, Hadrian's voice hardened. Is that what you are calling her? Kedrick did not respond. The silence answered louder than any words could have. The machinery ground forward. Celine transmitted her 7th intelligence package to Thornwell on a February night when ice storms turned Blackmore's towers into frozen monoliths, and the wind screamed with a fury that made the citadel walls vibrate at frequencies you felt in your teeth rather than heard with your ears. Thornwell's response arrived within hours. It contained 3 words that changed everything. The Crimson Hunt. Miravalle intended to use the annual royal hunting tradition in the northern forests as the staging ground for Caedric's assassination. Masked participants, isolated terrain, limited security perimeters, and a forest dense enough to conceal an army within bowshot of the Duke's hunting party. Celine delivered the intelligence to Caedric in the tower study at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. He is going to kill you in the forest and blame it on the royal family. Civil war starts before your body reaches Blackmore. Caedric read the decoded message twice. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not cold, not calculating, not the granite mask he wore like armor against a world that had been trying to destroy him since childhood. Something cracked beneath the surface. Something that existed behind the architecture of control he had spent 14 years constructing. He reached forward and took the decoded message from her hand. His fingers closed around hers for approximately 4 seconds longer than the transfer required. "Then we go to the Crimson Hunt," he said quietly, "and we end this." Celine felt the last possible exit from this path seal itself behind her with the finality of a fortress gate dropping into position. She had chosen. Not Virmont, not Miravalle, not the ghost of a dead father whose cipher she used to feed lies to men who trusted her bloodline. She had chosen Blackmore. And in Valadorn, choosing Blackmore meant there was no choosing anything else ever again. The northern forest swallowed daylight the way Blackmore Citadel swallowed ambition, completely, indifferently, without offering anything in return except the understanding that you had entered a system larger than yourself and the rules governing your survival had just fundamentally changed. Caedric rode at the head of a column of 40 mounted soldiers through frozen timber so dense that the canopy above formed a continuous ceiling of ice-locked branches, turning the forest floor into a corridor of permanent twilight where shadows moved independently of the objects casting them. His breath materialized in white clouds that dissolved against the collar of his black military coat. His eyes tracked the tree line with the systematic precision of a man who understood that the difference between hunting and being hunted was often nothing more than who noticed movement first. The Crimson Hunt had been a royal tradition for over 2 centuries, an annual gathering of noble houses in the forest north of the capital, where aristocrats performed ritualistic violence against wildlife while conducting the political negotiations too delicate for palace chambers. Masked riders, blood-red banners, weapons carried openly under the pretense of sport while alliances formed and dissolved between the frozen pines. This year, the ritual carried a different cargo entirely. Celine rode 6 positions behind the Duke, flanked by 2 Raven Guard guards whose presence communicated protection and surveillance in equal measure. She wore riding leather dyed the deep charcoal of Raven Guard household colors, her dark hair bound beneath a fur-lined hood that framed her face in shadow. The cold had turned her skin pale enough that her bronze eyes seemed to generate their own heat source, 2 points of amber burning inside a landscape stripped of color. She had transmitted her final disinformation package to Thornwell 48 hours before departure. The intelligence confirmed Caedric's hunting route, his security complement, and the precise location of his evening encampment inside the forest. Every detail was accurate except for 3 modifications so subtle that only someone with intimate knowledge of Raven Guard tactical doctrine would detect the discrepancies. The hunting route passed through a valley where Caedric's cavalry would have clear sight lines in every direction, rather than the forested ravine the original plan specified. The security complement was listed as 30 soldiers rather than the actual 40, and the evening encampment was positioned adjacent to a frozen river crossing that provided a natural choke point, defensible terrain that transformed an assassination attempt into an ambush against the assassins themselves. Miravale's people would arrive expecting a vulnerable target in isolated terrain. They would find a killing ground engineered by the man they intended to kill. The column reached the primary hunting grounds by late afternoon. Noble houses had already established encampments across the forest, pavilions of colored silk rising between ancient oaks like exotic fungi, surrounded by mounted soldiers and hunting dogs and servants carrying enough provisions to sustain a minor siege. The atmosphere combined aristocratic pageantry with the specific tension of a military staging area, and every experienced commander present understood that the silk concealed steel. Lord Cassian Miravale's encampment occupied the eastern ridge overlooking the main hunting valley. White pavilions bearing the Crown Guard's gold insignia, 50 mounted soldiers in ceremonial armor, and Cassian himself standing at the ridgeline in a white fur cloak, watching Caedric's column arrive with the patient expression of a man who believed he was observing the final hours of an enemy who did not yet understand he was already dead. That expression, visible even at 300 yards, confirmed everything. General Hadrian brought his horse alongside Caedric's mount as they crossed the valley floor toward their designated encampment position. Miravale's people are already positioned in the northern tree line. I count roughly 80 mounted soldiers beyond his official complement. They are wearing civilian hunting attire over military-grade armor. Expected. Caedric's voice carried no tension. The absence itself was more unsettling than any display of anxiety would have been. He operated with the flat calm of a surgical instrument approaching tissue it intended to separate from bone. What about the western approach? Commander Brielle has the 6th Company concealed in the ravine west of the river crossing. 200 cavalry. They will remain invisible until the signal. And the eastern timber? 4th Reconnaissance confirms an additional 40 to 50 unidentified riders moving through the forest in small groups. They converged on coordinates consistent with the false encampment location the Viramont girl transmitted. Caedric's jaw shifted slightly. They are staging for a night approach. Miravale intends to strike after the evening feast when security rotations thin during the celebration, which gives us approximately 6 hours, which gives us exactly the amount of time I designed this operation to require. They established camp on the elevated ground beside the frozen river. Raven Guard banners snapped in bitter wind while soldiers erected fortified positions disguised as hunting shelters. From the outside, the encampment appeared standard, a powerful duke settling into the ceremonial rhythms of the Crimson Hunt with appropriate military escort. From the inside, every tent placement, every fire position, every horse line had been calculated to create interlocking fields of engagement that would transform the camp into a defensive fortress the moment violence began. Celine dismounted and found Caedric waiting at the entrance to the command pavilion. His expression carried something she had not seen during the weeks of preparation, a quality that existed beneath the tactical composure, vibrating at a frequency that spoke not of uncertainty, but of the specific gravity that accumulated inside a human body when it understood that the next several hours would determine whether everything it had built survived or burned. Thornwell confirmed Miravale received the final intelligence package. She said, "He believes the approach is clean. And you? What do you believe?" She looked at him. Firelight from the nearest brazier caught the angles of his face and threw the hollows beneath his cheekbones into sharp relief, making him appear simultaneously younger and more ancient than his 28 years. A man who had consumed a lifetime of conflict inside a body that had barely finished growing. "I believe that Cassian Miravale is arrogant enough to trust intelligence delivered through a network he did not build, verified by assets he does not control, targeting a man he has consistently underestimated." She paused. "But I also believe that arrogant men occasionally stumble into competence by accident, and accidents in a forest full of armed conspirators tend to be fatal." "You are worried." "I am realistic. There is a difference." Caedric held her gaze for a duration that exceeded tactical communication. Something behind his gray eyes reached towards something behind her bronze ones. Not warmth, not vulnerability, but the particular gravity that existed between two people who understood each other at a structural level so fundamental that pretending otherwise required more energy than either of them currently possessed. Stay inside the command pavilion during the engagement. Hadrian will position a personal guard detail. No. The word landed between them with the density of dropped iron. I did not spend 7 weeks feeding disinformation to men who trust my dead father's name so that I could hide inside a tent while the consequences of that deception play out. Her voice carried an edge that cut through the frozen air. If Miravel's people discover the trap, the first person they will target after you is the intelligence source who betrayed them. I am safer near the fighting than sequestered in a pavilion that becomes a coffin the moment the perimeter is breached. Kedrick's breathing altered. That microscopic shift in rhythm that Celine had learned to read like text on a page. The man's body betraying calculations his face refused to display. You are describing combat proximity. I am describing survival. My survival, which I have been managing since before I entered Blackmoor Citadel, and will continue managing regardless of whether you approve of my methodology. The muscles along his jaw tightened and released, twice. Then you stay within visual range of Hadrian's position, non-negotiable. She did not argue, partly because the concession was tactically sound, partly because she recognized the thing he was refusing to say, that the prospect of her dying inside a trap he designed activated something in his chest that had nothing to do with strategic asset protection and everything to do with the territory that existed beyond strategy, where human attachment operated with total disregard for tactical rationality. He would not name it. She would not force him to. Naming it would make it targetable. The evening feast began at sunset inside the Grand Hunting Pavilion, a massive silken timber structure erected at the center of the valley where all noble houses converged under ceremonial truce. Torches lined the interior. Long tables carried roasted game and wine from 7 provinces. Masked servants moved between aristocrats wearing hunting costumes that ranged from austere military formality to theatrical extravagance. Cassian Miravel sat at the opposite end of the central table from Caedric, separated by 40 feet of polished oak and the accumulated weight of every lie, every threat, every intelligence transmission that had passed between their houses over the past 3 months. He wore his white crown guard ceremonial coat with gold threading that caught torchlight and seemed to pulse with its own energy. His mask, a ceremonial half-face in white porcelain, covered everything above his mouth, leaving visible only a smile that communicated warmth the way a loaded weapon communicates potential. He raised his goblet toward Caedric across the length of the table. To the Crimson Hunt, Your Grace, and to the traditions that remind us all that even the most powerful among us are subject to the laws of the forest. Caedric raised his own goblet without drinking. To clarity, Miravel, the forest has always excelled at revealing what men truly are beneath their ceremonial masks. The exchange carried enough subtext to arm a battalion. Nobles seated between them shifted uncomfortably, sensing detonation charges embedded inside polite language without being able to identify their exact location. 3 hours passed. Wine flowed. Tensions accumulated beneath increasingly strained performances of aristocratic camaraderie. Celine sat at Caedric's right hand, cataloging behavioral anomalies with the systematic focus of a woman who understood that the next 60 minutes would determine whether the architecture she had helped construct would hold or collapse. She noticed Commander Aldrin Voss before anyone else. Voss served as Caedric's senior intelligence officer, a position of absolute trust within Ravengard's inner circle. 41 years old, 15 years of service. A man who had personally overseen the interrogation of conspirators during Caedric's consolidation of power and had demonstrated loyalty through actions brutal enough to preclude any reasonable doubt about his allegiance. He was sweating, not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer would detect. But Celine had spent weeks inside Blackmoor Citadel, calibrating her perception to the behavioral baselines of every person in Caedric's inner circle, and Aldrin Voss's baseline did not include perspiration along his hairline at temperatures well below freezing. She watched him excuse himself from the table with a muttered reference to checking the perimeter guard rotation. She watched him move toward the pavilion's eastern exit with a stride that was 3% faster than his normal walking pace. She watched his right hand drift toward the interior pocket of his coat and make contact with something flat and rectangular, the dimensions of a folded message. Her stomach dropped through the frozen ground beneath her feet. She leaned toward Kaedric without turning her head. Her lips barely moved. Voss, eastern exit, now. Kaedric's eyes tracked to the intelligence officer's retreating figure. 2 seconds of observation. Then his entire body underwent a transformation so subtle that only someone touching him would have felt it. Every muscle fiber simultaneously engaging like a siege engine's mechanism being cranked into firing position. He stood from the table with the controlled casualness of a man excusing himself for fresh air. Hadrian read the movement instantly and rose from his position further down the table. Within 15 seconds, both men had exited the pavilion through the northern entrance while Celine maintained position at the table, her face displaying nothing while her pulse hammered against her throat at approximately 140 beats per minute. They found Voss at the tree line 60 yards east of the pavilion, passing a folded document to a rider wearing unmarked civilian clothing over military-grade leather armor. The rider's horse bore no house markings. The exchange was conducted with the practiced efficiency of a dead-drop protocol executed dozens of times before. Hadrian's soldiers materialized from the darkness like something geological emerging from the earth. 4 men. Silent. The rider was pulled from his horse and pinned to frozen ground before his hand reached his weapon. Voss spun toward the sound and found Kaedric standing 8 feet away, motionless, his face carrying an expression that the intelligence officer had seen directed at enemies, at traitors, at men whose names had been struck from historical records, but never at himself. Kaedric. Voss's voice cracked on the name. The use of the Duke's first name was itself a confession, a man reverting to personal address because the formal architecture of their relationship had just detonated. This is not what you think. What I think is that my senior intelligence officer just handed classified tactical documents to an unmarked courier operating within a hostile conspiracy's communication network. Kaedric's voice was so controlled it sounded mechanical. Something had shut down behind his eyes. Not rage, not grief, but the total severance of emotional connectivity that a mind performs when the alternative is processing a betrayal so fundamental that feeling it fully would compromise operational function. What I think is that every security assessment you have delivered for the past several months requires immediate reevaluation because the man producing them has been compromised. What I think is that the defensive positions I designed for tonight's engagement may contain vulnerabilities you introduced deliberately. Listen to me. Miravale has my family, my wife, my daughters. He took them from the estate 3 weeks ago and— Stop! The word cut through the frozen air with surgical finality. Kaedric closed the distance between them. 8 feet became 3. 3 became less than 2. Close enough that Voss could see what was happening inside the Duke's gray eyes. The architecture of trust collapsing in real time, load-bearing walls crumbling one after another while the structure they supported groaned toward catastrophic failure. You had access to every intelligence asset in my network. You reviewed every communication Celine transmitted. You knew the defensive positioning for tonight's operation. Kaedric's breathing had become something controlled to the point of mechanical. Each inhale measured, each exhale rationed, the body's autonomic systems overridden by a will that refused to let physiology betray the magnitude of what was breaking inside his chest. How much did you give him? Voss's face collapsed. The professional mask dissolved and beneath it was something raw and destroyed. The face of a man who had betrayed the only person he genuinely respected in order to protect the only people he genuinely loved, and understood that both loyalties had now been annihilated by the same decision. Everything. He has everything. The real encampment position, the cavalry in the western ravine, Brielle's signal protocol, all of it. Kaedric, he has my girls. They are 9 and 12 years old, and he will kill them if— Hadrian, the general stepped forward. How long before Miravale adjusts his assault plan based on accurate intelligence? Hadrian's expression carried the weight of a man performing battlefield calculus while the variables collapsed around him. If Voss transmitted the real positions within the last hour, Miravale needs 40 minutes minimum to redirect his forces. We have already lost the ambush architecture. The 6th Company's position in the western ravine is compromised. Pull them. Redistribute to the river crossing and the northern ridge. We fight defensive instead of offensive. That changes the entire operational geometry. We lose the element of surprise and fight outnumbered against forces who know our exact positions. Then we fight outnumbered against forces who know our exact positions. Kadrick's voice carried the terrible clarity of a mind that had already absorbed the catastrophe and moved past it into pure operational execution. No time for anger, no capacity for grief. Those luxuries belonged to men who could afford to feel things while the world burned around them. Kadrick had learned at 14 years old, kneeling beside his father's body on the floor of his own throne room, that survival meant converting every emotion into fuel and burning it so efficiently that nothing remained except forward motion. Signal Brielle. Full defensive redeployment, 20 minutes. He turned to Voss. The intelligence officer stood between two soldiers with the posture of a man whose skeleton had been replaced with something that could no longer support the weight of standing upright. Your family will be recovered. Hadrian will dispatch a separate extraction unit to Mirabel's eastern holdings immediately. If they are alive, my people will find them. He paused. The pause contained 14 years of trust being cremated inside a single exhale. You will remain under armed guard for the duration of this engagement. When it is over, your service record will be sealed, and your family relocated under assumed identities to a territory beyond Mirabel's reach. You will never enter Blackmoor Citadel again. You will never speak my name again. And you will spend the remainder of your life understanding that I showed you more mercy tonight than you showed me when you handed a man my death. He walked away before Voss could respond. The forest had become something different now. Not a hunting ground, not a stage for ceremonial violence, but a battlefield where the man who thought he controlled every variable had just discovered that the one variable he trusted most completely had been turned against him. Celine met him at the command pavilion entrance. One look at his face told her everything, not the details, the magnitude, the particular devastation that occurred when a man built entirely from control discovered that control was an illusion, maintained only as long as the people inside his architecture chose to maintain it. Voss, she said. Voss. How bad? Complete compromise. Mirabel has accurate intelligence on every defensive position. The ambush is inverted. We are now the targets inside our own trap. She absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, silently, completely, converting information into actionable structure while the emotional weight of it was filed into a compartment she would open later, or never. What do you need? Kedrick looked at her. In the torchlight, his face carried the raw exposure of a man whose armor had been stripped away by the one weapon he never defended against, the betrayal of someone he believed was incapable of betraying him. For approximately 2 seconds, the Duke of Ravengard was not a political architect, or a military strategist, or the most feared man on the continent. He was a human being standing in frozen darkness, realizing that the fortress he built around himself contained doors he did not know existed, opened by keys he did not know had been copied, leading to rooms where his destruction had been planned by hands he trusted enough to leave unmonitored. Then the 2 seconds ended. The architecture reassembled. The armor reconstituted. Whatever had been visible behind his eyes retreated behind walls that would take years to breach again, if they could be breached at all. I need you to do something that will change what you are, he said quietly. Thornwell still trusts you. Mirabel still believes you are working for him. If you transmit an emergency intelligence update in the next 15 minutes, telling Mirabel's forces that I have discovered the conspiracy and I am retreating north through the forest with a reduced guard, his assault force will redirect to intercept a target that does not exist. That buys Hadrian 60 minutes to complete defensive redeployment. Celine understood what he was asking, not the tactical mechanics, the human cost. Thornwell was connected to her father's network, men who had served House Viramont for decades, men who believed they were rescuing the last daughter of a murdered lord. She would be sending them false intelligence that would scatter their forces across frozen wilderness while Ravengard troops repositioned to destroy them. She would be using her father's legacy as ammunition against the last people on Earth who still honored his name. Something cracked inside her chest, not loudly, not dramatically. The small, structural sound of a load-bearing element reaching its maximum tolerance and beginning to deform under pressure it was never designed to sustain. She looked at Kaedric. He looked at her. And in the space between their locked gazes existed the complete architecture of the choice she faced, not between loyalty and betrayal, not between past and present, but between the woman she had been when she entered Blackmoor Citadel and the woman she would become the moment she transmitted that message. There was no version of this where she remained intact. Whichever direction she chose, something inside her would die tonight. The only question was which death she could survive. She held out her hand. "Give me the cipher materials. I need 6 minutes." Kadric placed the documents in her palm. His fingers closed around hers for 3 seconds. When he released them, both of them understood that something had been sealed between them that transcended alliance, transcended strategy, transcended the political machinery that brought them together. She had just agreed to destroy the last remnant of her father's world in order to protect the man who built his empire on its ashes. And the woman who walked toward the communications tent with cipher materials pressed against her chest was not the same woman who had entered Blackmoor Citadel wearing silver silk and silent fury 4 months ago. That woman was gone. Whatever replaced her would be something the kingdom had never seen before. Celine transmitted the false intelligence at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning and felt the last thread connecting her to House Veermont sever with a sensation that was less emotional than surgical. The clean, irreversible separation of tissue from bone, performed without anesthesia because anesthesia required the luxury of time, and time had just become the most expensive commodity in the northern forests of Valadorn. The message traveled through her father's cipher network with the speed of a lie designed to kill. Thornwell received it within minutes. Miravail's forward commanders received it within 20. And somewhere inside the frozen darkness between the hunting pavilions and the river crossing, roughly 130 armed men began redirecting their assault toward a retreat corridor that contained nothing except empty forest and the ghost of a target that had never existed. 60 minutes. That was what Kadric had calculated. 60 minutes before Miravail's scattered forces recognized the deception, reformed their assault architecture, and converged on the actual Raven Guard position with the focused fury of men who understood they had been outmaneuvered by a dead nobleman's daughter, using their own trust as a weapon. Hadrian used every second. The Sixth Company abandoned the compromised western ravine in disciplined silence, 200 cavalry moving through frozen timber with the practiced coordination of men trained to treat noise as a tactical liability, equivalent to exposed flanks. They redistributed along the northern ridge and the river crossing, establishing defensive positions that transformed the natural terrain into overlapping kill zones. Archers occupied elevated ground between ancient oaks whose trunks were wide enough to absorb crossbow bolts. Infantry dug into frozen earth behind hastily constructed barriers of fallen timber and packed snow. The camp itself became something different. Fires were extinguished. Pavilions collapsed into flat profiles that eliminated silhouettes against the snow. Horses were moved to the rear perimeter and secured with handlers ready to deploy mounted counterattacks through prepared lanes in the defensive line. Kadric stood at the center of it all, issuing commands with the compressed efficiency of a man whose mind had already processed the catastrophe and moved entirely into operational territory where emotion was not suppressed but converted. Fear became situational awareness, rage became tactical precision. The devastation of Voss's betrayal became fuel for a cognitive engine running at output levels that the officers surrounding him had never witnessed in 15 years of service. Commander Brielle approached at a dead run. A woman in her late 30s with the compact musculature of someone who had spent 2 decades earning authority through competence so absolute that gender became irrelevant inside her chain of command. Her face carried the particular tension of a field officer delivering intelligence she knew would alter the operational landscape. 3 riders intercepted at the southern perimeter. Crown Guard uniforms beneath civilian hunting gear. They were carrying signal flares, the type used for coordinated multi-point assault initiation. How many assault points? Based on the flare distribution pattern, 4. North, east, south, and a river crossing approach using the frozen surface as a cavalry lane. 4 points with approximately 130 redirected soldiers means 30 to 35 per approach, plus whatever reserves Miravail retained under his direct command. My scouts report a secondary force of roughly 50 mounted soldiers holding position on the eastern ridge. They have not moved since the feast ended. Those are his reserves. His personal guard. Kaedric absorbed the numbers the way a structural engineer absorbs load calculations. Not with hope or fear, but with the cold assessment of whether the architecture could sustain the pressure being applied to it. 200 defenders against 180 attackers across 4 assault vectors, plus a 50-soldier reserve. The mathematics favored defense, the terrain favored defense. But mathematics and terrain operated under the assumption that your defensive positions had not been comprehensively mapped by a traitor who spent 15 years memorizing every tactical preference, every contingency protocol, every instinctive response pattern of the man commanding them. Voss had not merely betrayed Kaedric's positions. He had betrayed Kaedric's mind. Every defensive decision the Duke made tonight would unfold inside a framework that Miravel's commanders already understood, because the man who built that framework had handed them the architectural drawings, which meant the framework had to change. Kaedric turned to Hadrian. The general stood 3 feet away with the grounded stillness of a man who had survived enough battles to understand that the most dangerous moment in any engagement was the one where the commander decided whether to fight the battle he planned or the battle that actually existed. Pull the northern ridge position. Hadrian's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The micro-recalculation of a strategist absorbing an order that contradicted the defensive architecture they had spent 45 minutes constructing. The northern ridge controls the high ground. Abandoning it creates an opening that Miravel's northern assault force will exploit, because Voss told them the northern ridge is our strongest position. They expect heavy resistance there. They will have allocated their most experienced soldiers to that vector. When they find it empty, they will advance through the gap believing they have achieved a breakthrough. Instead, they will funnel into the valley floor where Brielle's archers have unobstructed fire lanes from the eastern tree line. He paused. His breathing was even, measured, the physiological output of a body that had learned to treat crisis as a baseline state rather than an exception. Voss gave them the map of my mind, so I am drawing a different map. Every position he revealed becomes a vacancy. Every tactic he predicted becomes a feint. We are not fighting Miravel tonight, Hadrian. We are fighting the version of me that Voss sold him, and that version no longer exists. Hadrian studied his duke for 3 full seconds. Then something settled across his weathered features. Not relief, not confidence, but the particular recognition of a man watching another man exceed the boundaries of what he believed that mind was capable of producing under pressure. Understood. Brielle, reposition your archers to the eastern tree line. Full concealment. Fire discipline until the northern force reaches the valley floor. The redeployment took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Celine stood at the edge of the command position watching Kaedric dismantle and reconstruct his entire defensive strategy with the savage fluency of someone who understood that the most dangerous version of yourself was the version your enemies had prepared for. And the only way to survive was to become someone they had never met. She recognized the process because she had performed an identical transformation 6 minutes ago inside a communications tent, transmitting a message that killed the last version of herself that still belonged to her father's world. They were both operating as new architectures now, structures built in real time from the wreckage of the structures that came before. The first assault hit at 3:17 in the morning, the southern vector. Approximately 35 mounted soldiers emerging from the tree line in a wedge formation designed to penetrate defensive perimeters through concentrated momentum. Their horses threw clouds of snow into torchlight that had been deliberately positioned to blind approaching riders while illuminating them as targets. The sound arrived before the visual. Thunder conducted through frozen earth, vibrating upward through boot soles and knee joints, and into the chest cavity where it merged with heartbeat until the two rhythms became indistinguishable. Raven Guard infantry held the southern barricade with the disciplined ferocity of men defending ground they had been told to hold until they were dead or the enemy was. Crossbow volleys shattered the cavalry wedge's leading edge. Horses screamed, a sound that existed outside the spectrum of anything human vocal cords could produce, a sound that colonized the nervous system and refused to leave. Riders fell into snow that turned dark within seconds. The assault fractured against the barricade and reformed twice before withdrawing into the tree line, leaving 11 bodies in the snow and the particular silence that follows violence. Not peace, but the temporary exhaustion of the air itself, as though the atmosphere required recovery time between episodes of human beings attempting to destroy each other. The eastern assault hit 4 minutes later, then the river crossing. Each vector encountered defensive positions that did not match the intelligence Voss had provided. Assault forces arrived expecting weak points and found reinforced kill zones. They arrived expecting predictable response patterns and found tactical improvisations that contradicted everything their commanders had been told about how Caedric Ravengard conducted defensive operations. The confusion was lethal. Miravalle's forces had trained for a specific enemy and discovered in the worst possible way that the specific enemy no longer existed. The northern assault force made the fatal mistake. 40 soldiers advanced through the gap left by the abandoned ridge position with the aggressive confidence of men exploiting a breakthrough they believed their intelligence had guaranteed. They poured into the valley floor in loose formation, spreading across open ground to establish a staging area for a flanking attack against the Ravengard camp's northern perimeter. Brielle's archers opened fire from the eastern tree line at 70 yards. The valley became a killing ground in under 90 seconds. Crossbow bolts arrived from angles the assault force had not anticipated, because the intelligence they received placed no archers in the eastern position. Men fell in clusters. Horses collapsed sideways, pinning riders beneath 1,200 pounds of dying animal. The formation disintegrated into individual survival. Men running for cover that did not exist across open ground designed by geography and exploited by tactical genius to offer no concealment in any direction. Caedric watched from the command position with an expression that belonged to something older than the 28-year-old body containing it. He felt no satisfaction. Satisfaction was a response to victory, and this was not victory. This was the mechanical output of a mind that had been forged inside violence since childhood, and had learned to convert that violence into structured outcomes because the alternative was being consumed by it. Men were dying in the valley below because a man he trusted betrayed him. Those deaths were consequences of a failure that originated inside his own judgment, the judgment that believed 15 years of loyalty rendered a human being incapable of choosing someone else's survival over his. That belief was dead now. Buried beside it was something he would not examine tonight, or perhaps ever. The understanding that every relationship he had ever maintained operated inside a framework of trust that could be penetrated, corrupted, and weaponized by anyone with sufficient leverage against the people inside it, including Celine. The thought arrived unbidden and detonated somewhere behind his sternum with a force that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with the specific terror of a man who had allowed himself to rely on another human being and now understood at a cellular level what that reliance actually cost when the architecture failed. He killed the thought, not suppressed it, killed it, executed it with the same cold efficiency he applied to every threat that endangered his operational function. There was a war happening in the forest. There were men dying under his command. The woman standing 30 feet behind him had just destroyed her own family's legacy to protect his life. Whatever mechanism inside his chest was attempting to process those facts would have to wait until the killing stopped, assuming it ever did. Miravalle's reserves are moving. Hadrian's voice cut through the cognitive static with the precision of a blade designed for exactly this purpose, returning Caedric's attention to the immediate tactical reality. The eastern ridge. 50 mounted soldiers in formation, descending toward the valley with the deliberate pace of a force held in reserve for exactly this moment, the moment when the initial assault waves had revealed the defensive layout through their own destruction, mapping the actual positions through casualty patterns rather than compromised intelligence. Cassian Miravalle rode at their center, white cloak over armor, gold insignia catching firelight from burning debris scattered across the battlefield. Even at 200 yards, his posture communicated something that Caedric recognized with the instinctive precision of one apex predator identifying another, not desperation, but recalculation. Cassian had absorbed the failure of his assault plan and was now operating in real time, adapting his approach based on what the battle itself had revealed. This was the version of Miravalle that Caedric had always suspected existed beneath the ceremonial charm and political performance. The version that did not require intelligence reports or predetermined plans because it processed tactical information through direct observation and adjusted faster than structured strategy could counter. "He is coming straight for us," Brielle said. Her voice carried the flat effect of a career soldier stating facts that required no emotional interpretation. His reserve force will hit the northern perimeter in approximately 6 minutes. Our infantry there took casualties during the initial engagement. I have maybe 40 effective soldiers holding that line. 40 against 50. 40 exhausted against 50 fresh. Those are not equivalent numbers. Kadric drew his sword. The sound of steel leaving leather scabbard carried across the command position with a clarity that silenced every other sound within earshot. Officers turned, soldiers stared. Hadrian's expression underwent a transformation that moved through surprise, recognition, and grim acceptance in approximately 1.5 seconds. "You are not leading a cavalry charge," Hadrian said. "I am doing exactly that. If you die on that field, everything dies. The defensive redeployment, the intelligence operation, every strategic position we hold across the kingdom. Ravengard collapses within a month. If I hide behind infantry lines while Miravale charges my perimeter with 50 fresh cavalry, every soldier on this field understands that their duke values his own survival above theirs. Morale collapses within an hour, which kills the same number of people over a longer and more painful timeline." Kadric swung onto his horse with the fluid violence of a man whose body had been trained since childhood to treat combat as a physical language. 14 years ago, my father died because he sat on his throne and waited for the threat to come to him. I do not sit. I do not wait. I go to the thing that is trying to kill me, and I make it regret the attempt. He turned to Celine. She stood at the edge of the command position with a crossbow she had taken from a wounded soldier, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman watching the man she had chosen to protect ride toward the thing most likely to destroy him. Their eyes met for approximately 2 seconds. He did not say anything. Neither did she. The 2 seconds contained everything that language would have diluted. The complete acknowledgement that what existed between them had exceeded strategic alliance, exceeded political architecture, exceeded every rational framework either of them had constructed to explain why they continued choosing each other over safer alternatives. He was riding toward death because he could not be the kind of man who let others die in his place. She was staying behind because she could not be the kind of woman who let emotional attachment override tactical positioning. Both decisions were correct. Both decisions were devastating. Kadric kicked his horse forward. 23 Ravengard cavalry fell in behind him, every mounted soldier available at the command position. They rode north through the camp at full gallop, snow erupting beneath hooves, breath crystallizing in air that tasted like smoke and iron, and the particular chemical sharpness of fear being metabolized into adrenaline at rates that turned human beings into something faster, stronger, and more dangerous than their biology was designed to sustain. The two forces collided at the northern perimeter with a sound that existed outside the category of noise and entered the category of geological event. Metal striking metal, bone striking earth. The screaming of horses and men creating a unified frequency of destruction that vibrated through frozen ground and registered in the bodies of every human being within half a mile as a physical sensation, a tremor in the sternum, a pressure behind the eyes, the involuntary tightening of every muscle preparing for impact that had already occurred. Kadric fought at the center of the collision. His sword work was not elegant, it was architectural. Each strike designed to dismantle the opponent's defensive structure rather than penetrate it, targeting weapon arms, destabilizing seat positions, creating cascading failures in the enemy's ability to maintain combat effectiveness. He took a lance strike across his left shoulder that split leather and drew a line of blood from collarbone to bicep. The pain arrived as information rather than sensation, his nervous system categorizing the wound as non-critical and redistributing attention to the three riders converging on his position from the right flank. He killed the first one with a lateral strike that caught the rider between helmet and gorget. The second he unseated by driving his horse directly into the man's mount, at an angle that exploited the natural instability of a horse receiving unexpected lateral force. The third he disarmed with a technique Hadrian had taught him at 15 years old, a bind and twist that used the opponent's own momentum to strip the weapon from hands numbed by cold and impact. Blood covered his sword arm to the elbow, his own or others. The distinction no longer registered. His body operated inside a state that existed beyond fear and beyond courage, in the territory where a human organism has committed so completely to the act of survival that every system, cardiovascular, muscular, neurological, endocrine, synchronized into a single output configuration optimized for one function, continuing to exist for the next 30 seconds, and the next 30 after that, and the next 30 after that, until the threat was neutralized or the body failed. And then the sound changed. Across the battlefield, from the direction of the Raven Guard camp, something new entered the auditory landscape. Not cavalry, not infantry. A horn, low and sustained, carrying across the frozen forest with a resonance that bypassed the ear and registered directly in the chest cavity. Cadric knew that horn. Blackmore's garrison signal. Reinforcements. Impossible. The garrison was 3 days' ride from the hunting grounds, and no messenger had been dispatched, unless someone had dispatched one without his knowledge. He turned his horse toward the camp and saw them emerging from the southern tree line, a column of heavy cavalry in full Raven Guard black, at least 200 riders pouring into the battlefield with the organized violence of a force that had been riding hard for 36 hours and arrived with exactly the momentum required to transform a contested engagement into a decisive rout. At the column's head rode a figure he did not recognize, smaller than a cavalry commander, wearing a military coat over riding leather, dark hair streaming behind in the wind. Not Hadrian, not Brielle, Celine. She had sent the garrison dispatch before they left Blackmore, before the Crimson Hunt, before the betrayal, before any of this. She had calculated the possibility of operational failure and positioned a contingency that existed outside every strategic framework Caedric or Voss or Meyervale had access to, because she had told no one. Not Caedric, not Hadrian, not any intelligence officer who could be compromised. She had trusted no one with the information because she understood, with the clarity that only a woman raised inside the wreckage of misplaced trust could achieve, that the only secure contingency was one that existed inside a single mind. The garrison cavalry hit Meyervale's reserve force from the southern flank, with the impact of an avalanche striking a structure that was already fracturing under its own weight. The tactical geometry of the battle inverted instantaneously. Miravalle's 50 soldiers found themselves caught between Caedric's force to the north and 200 fresh cavalry to the south, the military definition of envelopment, the position from which historically 0% of surrounded forces had ever extracted themselves intact. Cassian Miravalle's white cloak was visible at the center of the collapse. His horse wheeled in desperate circles as his command structure disintegrated around him. Officers fell, riders scattered. The ceremonial gold of the Crown Guard insignia disappeared beneath mud and blood and the trampled snow of a battlefield that no longer recognized the distinction between hunter and prey. Caedric spurred his horse through the carnage toward the white cloak. Blood ran down his left arm from the shoulder wound and dripped from his fingertips onto snow that had already absorbed enough blood to turn the entire northern perimeter into a canvas of frozen red and black. His vision narrowed to a single target. His hearing compressed to a single frequency, the sound of his own heartbeat hammering at a rate that exceeded sustainable output, and continued anyway because the body had committed to this trajectory and biology was no longer accepting override commands. He reached Meyervale at the center of the collapsed formation. Cassian's horse had been killed beneath him. He stood on the battlefield with his sword drawn, surrounded by fallen soldiers from both sides, his white cloak soaked crimson from collar to hem. Blood ran from a gash above his left eye. His ceremonial armor had been dented by multiple impacts. But his posture, feet planted, blade raised, eyes locked on the Duke approaching through smoke and falling ash, communicated something that Caedric recognized with the grim familiarity of a man who had seen that exact posture in his own mirror for 14 years. A man who had decided he would rather die standing than survive on his knees. Caedric dismounted. The battlefield continued its violence around them. Cavalry charges, infantry engagements, the systematic destruction of a conspiracy that had spent months building toward this moment, only to discover that the moment belonged to someone else. But within the 10-foot radius surrounding the two men facing each other across trampled snow, a pocket of silence formed. The kind of silence that existed at the center of storms. The kind that preceded events from which there was no returning. Cassian spat blood into the snow between them. She betrayed us. The Veermont girl. She was never yours to keep, Ravenguard. She was ours to deploy. She was never anyone's. That is the miscalculation that destroyed you. This is not over. Kill me tonight, and the crown tears your house apart within a year. The monarchy will not tolerate. The monarchy will tolerate whatever I decide it tolerates, the same way it has tolerated everything else I have decided for the past 14 years. You gambled that I could be killed by the same methods that killed lesser men. You lost. Cassian raised his sword. His arms trembled, not from fear but from the physiological reality of a body that had sustained multiple combat impacts and was operating on adrenaline reserves that were rapidly approaching depletion. Caedric raised his, and from the eastern tree line, at the exact moment both men committed to the final exchange, a crossbow bolt punched through the frozen air and buried itself in Caedric's right side, 3 inches below his ribcage. He looked down. The bolt shaft protruded from his torso at an angle consistent with an elevated firing position, the eastern ridge. A position his forces did not control. A position that should have been empty. Blood began soaking through his coat with the slow certainty of a system that had been catastrophically breached. His sword dropped 6 inches as his right arm lost structural integrity. And Cassian Miravale, seeing the opening that a dying conspiracy had just purchased with a single hidden archer, lunged forward with everything his broken body could produce. Caedric's body registered the crossbow bolt before his mind finished processing the visual information. A detonation of nerve signals radiating outward from the entry point below his ribcage, converting his entire right side into a geography of white-hot structural failure that rewrote the operational parameters of every muscle group connected to his torso. His right arm lost 40% of its effective strength in under 2 seconds. His sword dropped from high guard to mid guard, with the involuntary descent of a limb whose supporting architecture had been compromised at the foundation. Cassian's lunge arrived inside that window of diminished capacity. The blade came in low and angled, a strike designed to exploit exactly the kind of right-side weakness that a torso wound produced. Fast, committed. The output of a body burning its final reserves of adrenaline in a single expenditure calculated to end the fight before the wounded man's combat reflexes could compensate for the damage. Caedric did not parry. Parrying required right-side rotation. Right-side rotation required abdominal engagement. Abdominal engagement required structural integrity that a crossbow bolt had just eliminated. His body understood this faster than his conscious mind and executed the only viable alternative. He stepped into the attack rather than away from it, closing the distance to a range where Cassian's blade could not achieve full cutting arc, and drove his left shoulder into Miravale's chest with the force of a man whose survival instinct had bypassed every rational circuit and connected directly to the locomotive systems governing gross motor output. The impact sent both men to the ground. Snow. Blood. The metallic taste of copper flooding Caedric's mouth as the bolt shifted inside his torso and introduced a secondary wave of damage that his nervous system processed as something beyond pain, a systemic alarm indicating that the body's internal architecture was experiencing failure at a rate that required immediate cessation of physical activity. He did not cease. He could not. Cessation meant death, not the abstract philosophical death that men contemplated during peacetime, the immediate mechanical death of a blade entering flesh while you lay immobilized on frozen ground. Caedric had understood since the age of 14 that survival was not a state. It was an action, a continuous, uninterrupted verb that demanded execution regardless of the body's protests, regardless of the mind's calculations about probability, regardless of every rational indicator suggesting that the optimal response was surrender. Surrender was a concept designed by people who had never been required to survive. He pinned Cassian's sword arm beneath his left knee and pressed down with his full body weight. Miravale's wrist flexed against the pressure. The tendons visible beneath skin stretched tight over bone, straining against leverage that the position denied them. Cassian's free hand clawed at Caedric's wounded side, fingers finding the bolt shaft and twisting. The pain obliterated coherent thought for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which Caedric's vision reduced to a tunnel of white and red. And the only thing preventing unconsciousness was the absolute biological refusal of a nervous system that had been conditioned through 14 years of perpetual threat to treat unconsciousness as equivalent to death. His left hand found Cassian's throat. Not a strike, a grip. The kind of grip that communicated finality through pressure alone. The slow, methodical compression of airway and vascular structures that transformed a man's breathing from autonomous function to controlled commodity. Cassian's eyes widened. His free hand abandoned the bolt and seized Kaedric's wrist, pulling against a grip that should have been weakened by blood loss and torso damage, but instead operated with the paradoxical strength of a system that had nothing left to protect except the hand currently wrapped around the throat of the man trying to kill it. "You are dying," Cassian managed through compressed vocal cords. The words came out strangled, distorted, stripped of the polished charm that had defined his political persona for 35 years. "That bolt hit your liver. You have minutes. Then you have less." Kaedric increased the pressure. Cassian's face transitioned through colors that mapped the progressive failure of cerebral oxygenation. Red to purple to something approaching gray as the vascular compression reached levels that his cardiovascular system could not overcome through elevated heart rate alone. His legs kicked against frozen ground. His fingers dug into Kaedric's wrist with the desperate energy of a body executing its final automated survival protocols without conscious direction. And then a voice cut through the battlefield noise with the precision of something designed to penetrate exactly this kind of chaos. "Kaedric, stop!" Celine. She stood 8 feet away. The military coat she had worn at the head of the garrison cavalry was torn at the shoulder and darkened with blood that might have been hers or might have belonged to the battle she had ridden through to reach this position. The crossbow was gone. Her hands were empty. Her bronze eyes locked onto the scene with the absolute focus of a woman processing 3 simultaneous calculations. The tactical assessment of whether Cassian Miravail was more valuable alive than dead, the medical assessment of how much blood the man she had chosen was losing per second, and the psychological assessment of what it would cost Kaedric Ravengard's remaining humanity to kill a defenseless man with his bare hands on a frozen battlefield. "He is more useful breathing," she said. Her voice carried no emotion, not because she felt none, but because emotion in this moment was a structural liability that would compromise the clarity required to prevent the man in front of her from committing an act that would follow him through every remaining night of his life. A dead Miravail becomes a martyr. A captured Miravail becomes evidence. Every noble house that supported his conspiracy collapses the moment he testifies under formal interrogation. You kill him here, you win a battle. You keep him alive, you win the kingdom. Kaedric's hand did not move. Beneath him, Cassian's struggles were weakening. The kicks losing coordination, the grip on his wrist transitioning from active resistance to reflexive grasping. 30 more seconds and the decision would be made by physiology rather than choice. Celine stepped closer. 5 feet. 3 feet. Close enough that she could see the individual striations in Kaedric's gray eyes. Not cold anymore, not calculating, but burning with something that existed beneath the architecture of control he had maintained since childhood. Rage so old and so compressed that releasing it through the simple act of squeezing a throat closed felt less like violence than like exhaling, like finally allowing the pressure that had been building since the night his father died to escape through the only channel it had ever been offered. She knelt beside him. She did not touch his hand. She did not attempt to pry his fingers loose. She placed her palm flat against the side of his face, the left side, the side not covered in blood, and held it there. The contact was not gentle. It was structural. An external reference point introduced into a system that had lost all internal calibration. Something real and warm and alive pressing against skin that had forgotten what any sensation other than violence felt like. "Kaedric, look at me." His eyes shifted from Cassian's discoloring face to hers. The transition took approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which something behind those gray eyes fought a war more brutal than anything happening on the battlefield around them. The part of him that had survived by becoming harder than everything trying to destroy him versus the part of him that recognized, with a clarity so painful it registered as physical sensation, that hardness without limit was not survival. It was fossilization. the slow conversion of a living thing into stone that maintained the shape of what it used to be without retaining any of the properties that made it alive. His grip released. Cassian collapsed sideways into the snow, gasping in ragged, desperate lungfuls of frozen air. His hands went to his throat. His body curled into the fetal position of a nervous system overwhelmed by the simultaneous experience of oxygen deprivation and oxygen restoration. Kedrick sat back on his heels. The bolt protruded from his right side like a structural flaw made visible. Physical evidence of the vulnerability that his entire life had been designed to prevent. Blood had soaked through his coat and onto the snow in a pattern that expanded with each heartbeat, mapping the rate of internal damage in a medium that everyone present could read. "Hadrian," Celine said without looking away from Kedrick. Her voice carried the flat authority of someone issuing commands in a chain of command that had not existed 5 minutes ago, but that every soldier within earshot immediately recognized as legitimate. "Field surgeon, now, and secure Mirabel for transport. If he dies before reaching Blackmore, the person responsible answers to me." Hadrian materialized from the surrounding chaos and took one look at the bolt in Kedrick's torso. His face underwent a controlled implosion, the kind of emotional event that career soldiers contained through discipline rather than displayed through expression. "How long has that been in him?" "Too long. Move." The next 7 hours existed in a state of compressed temporal distortion that Celine would later recall as a single continuous moment rather than a sequence of discrete events. Field surgeons worked on Kedrick inside the command pavilion, while the battle's aftermath organized itself around them. Prisoners secured, wounded collected, dead catalogued with the administrative precision that military organizations applied to the aftermath of violence, because the alternative was acknowledging the scale of what had just occurred in human rather than operational terms. The bolt had penetrated 2 inches into tissue adjacent to Kedrick's liver without perforating the organ itself. A margin of survival measured in millimeters that would have produced a different outcome if the archer's aim had shifted by the width of a fingernail. The field surgeon extracted it with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that the patient on his table was not merely a wounded soldier, but the structural foundation upon which the governance of an entire kingdom rested, and that the difference between a successful extraction and a fatal hemorrhage was the difference between political continuity and civilizational collapse. Kedrick remained conscious throughout, not because the pain was manageable, it was not, but because consciousness was a choice he made the same way he made every other choice, deliberately, through the application of will against circumstances that would have justified surrender. He watched the tent ceiling while surgical instruments operated inside his torso and thought about Voss, about trust, about the fundamental architecture of human relationships, and how a man who had built an empire on the principle that vulnerability equaled death had just survived because a woman he could not fully control placed her hand against his face and introduced into his collapsing system the one variable his architecture had never accounted for: the possibility that letting someone inside the perimeter was not a defensive failure, but a structural necessity. His father had died because he trusted the wrong person. Kedrick had nearly died because the right person trusted him enough to build a contingency he never asked for. The distinction was the most important thing he had ever learned, and it had cost more than he knew how to calculate. Spring arrived in Validorn the way it always arrived, slowly, reluctantly, as though the season itself required convincing that the kingdom deserved the reprieve. Snow retreated from the capital's rooftops over a period of weeks. Rivers thawed. The perpetual storm clouds that surrounded Blackmore Citadel thinned enough to admit sunlight for the first time in 5 months, casting unfamiliar gold across obsidian towers that had forgotten what color looked like. The political aftermath of the Crimson Hunt restructured the kingdom's power architecture with the systematic thoroughness of a controlled demolition followed by engineered reconstruction. Cassian Mirabel survived transport to Blackmore. His formal interrogation produced 17 days of testimony that implicated 43 noble families, 12 Crown Guard officers, and the Royal Treasury's Deputy Chancellor in a conspiracy to assassinate the Duke and partition Validorn into semi-autonomous territories governed by an aristocratic council that would have replaced centralized authority with collective self-interest. The trials were public. Kedrick insisted on visibility over efficiency, Not because he valued spectacle, but because he understood that the conspiracy's power had been built on secrecy, and the most effective method of dismantling a secret power structure was exposing its architecture to the same public it had been designed to exploit. Noble houses fell, estates were seized, military commands were restructured under officers whose loyalty had been verified through the only reliable method available, the test of crisis, where the pressure of genuine threat separated genuine allegiance from performed allegiance with a precision that peacetime assessment could never replicate. The monarchy itself retreated further into ceremonial irrelevance. The king issued formal statements condemning the conspiracy from the safety of a throne room that Raven Guard soldiers now guarded, and the irony of a monarch protected by the same military force he theoretically commanded was lost on no one. Cadric recovered slowly. The wound healed with the grudging cooperation of a body that had been operating beyond sustainable limits for 14 consecutive years and seized upon the forced inactivity of surgical recovery to present its comprehensive invoice for services rendered. He spent 3 weeks confined to chambers, attended by physicians whose instructions he followed with the visible discomfort of a man for whom accepting care from others required a more fundamental recalibration than any political restructuring he had ever conducted. Celine managed the transition, not as a deputy, not as a proxy, as the second architecture inside a dual system that the kingdom's surviving power structures recognized as permanent before either Kaedric or Celine formally announced it. She chaired council sessions with the cold precision that the court had learned to associate with Raven Guard governance. She reviewed intelligence reports, approved military deployments, and conducted negotiations with foreign ambassadors who arrived expecting to exploit a wounded duke and discovered instead a woman whose strategic capability operated at the same level as the man she stood beside. Not because she imitated him, but because the same environmental pressures that shaped his mind had shaped hers, producing parallel architectures that reinforced each other's structural integrity rather than competing for the same load-bearing function. The court adapted. The kingdom adapted. Human systems always adapted to new power configurations, not through acceptance, but through the pragmatic recognition that adaptation was cheaper than resistance when the alternative to cooperation was annihilation. Hadrian watched the evolution from his permanent position at the intersection of military authority and personal loyalty. One evening, 6 weeks after the Crimson Hunt, he found Kaedric in the tower study reviewing the final reports from Miravel's trial proceedings. The Duke stood at the window overlooking the capital, a posture Hadrian had observed thousands of times over 15 years of service, but that tonight carried a quality he had never seen before. Something in the set of Kaedric's shoulders had changed, not softened, restructured, the way a bridge that has survived an earthquake requires reinforcement at different points than the original engineering anticipated. Voss's family was recovered, Hadrian said. His wife and both daughters. They were held at Miravel's eastern estate, unharmed. Kaedric did not turn from the window. And Voss himself? Relocated under assumed identity to the western coast. He will not surface again. The silence that followed contained the weight of a relationship that had lasted 15 years and ended in a frozen forest because a man loved his children more than he loved his honor. Kaedric understood the calculus. He had always understood the calculus. Voss had not betrayed him out of malice or ambition or ideological opposition. He had betrayed him because someone placed a blade against the throats of the only people whose survival mattered more than loyalty, and Voss had made the choice that any father would make. The understanding did not reduce the damage. Understanding a wound's origin did not close it, but it changed the quality of the scar, converting it from evidence of enemy action into evidence of the fundamental limitation that existed inside every human architecture, no matter how carefully constructed. People were not fortifications. They could not be sealed against all threats. They contained doors that love and fear and attachment kept permanently unlocked, and the only question was whether you built your system to account for those doors or spent your life pretending they did not exist. Kaedric had spent 14 years pretending. He was finished pretending. Hadrian, Your Grace, you told me once that my father trusted the wrong person and died for it. You were right, but you left out the second half of that lesson. He turned from the window. The scar tissue from the bolt wound pulled against his rib cage as he moved, a permanent reminder written in his own flesh that invulnerability was a performance, not a condition. The second half is that refusing to trust anyone does not prevent betrayal. It prevents recovery. My father died because one person failed him. I survived because one person chose me. The difference is not who you trust. The difference is whether you have built something worth being chosen for. Hadrian studied his duke for a long moment. Then something shifted in the old soldier's weathered expression. Not surprise, not sentiment, but the quiet recognition of a man watching a process he had waited 15 years to witness. The architecture was the same. The iron was the same. The relentless, grinding, magnificent will that had held this kingdom together through pure force of character was the same. But something had been added, not warmth, not softness, something more structurally significant than either. Depth. The understanding that strength without self-knowledge was not strength at all. It was armor worn by a man who had forgotten he was still bleeding underneath. Your father would not have understood that, Hadrian said. My father did not survive long enough to learn it. I did. Barely. He returned to the dispatches on his desk. The conversation was over. But its resonance continued through the stone walls of the tower and into the corridors of a citadel that had housed 3 generations of Ravengard rulers, and was only now, for the first time, housing one who understood that the purpose of power was not domination. It was the construction of something durable enough to protect the people standing inside it, including the person wielding it. The formal ceremony took place on the first day of summer. Not a wedding. Cedric despised ceremonial performances, and Selene possessed even less tolerance for theatrical governance than he did. Instead, the Duke issued a single proclamation, 47 words read from the steps of Blackmoor Citadel before the assembled court and the gathered citizens of the capital. The proclamation designated Lady Selene Viermont as Duchess Selene Ravengard, co-sovereign of Valadorn's governing authority, with full and permanent command privileges across all military, economic, and political structures of the realm. 47 words that restructured a kingdom. Selene stood beside him during the reading, wearing Ravengard black, with a single accent of silver at her collar, the color of the dress she wore the night she walked into the citadel and refused to lower her eyes. The court understood the reference. The kingdom understood the message. The woman who entered Blackmoor as the orphaned daughter of a disgraced house now stood at its pinnacle through a process that had nothing to do with marriage or inheritance or any of the conventional mechanisms through which women historically accessed power. She had earned it, through intelligence deployed under pressure that would have broken most operatives, through loyalty demonstrated at a cost that most people would have refused to pay, through the decision to destroy her own father's legacy in order to protect a man she had chosen with full awareness of what that choice would demand and what it would permanently remove from the taxonomy of available futures. The court bowed. The capital bowed. And somewhere in the frozen mountains beyond Blackmoor's walls, wind moved through the same passes and valleys it had moved through for centuries, indifferent to the ambitions and betrayals and transformations of the human beings building their temporary empires beneath its path. Months later. An evening in early autumn. Cedric and Selene stood on the highest balcony of Blackmoor Citadel, watching the capital's lights materialize below as darkness consumed the valley. The air carried the transitional quality of a season ending, warm enough to stand outside without military coats, cool enough to feel the approach of something colder, something that would test every system and structure and relationship built during the months of rebuilding. Cedric rested his hands on the stone railing. His right hand still carried a faint tremor from nerve damage sustained during the Crimson Hunt, a permanent imperfection in a body that had previously refused to acknowledge imperfection as a possible state of existence. He had learned to work around it. He had learned to work around many things that 14 years of self-constructed invulnerability had never required him to confront. Selene stood beside him, with her shoulder touching his arm, not leaning against him, not seeking support, occupying adjacent space with the natural ease of a person who had earned the right to stand there through a process more rigorous than any military campaign or political negotiation the kingdom had ever produced. Thornwell was captured last week, she said. Hadrian's intelligence division tracked him to a fishing village on the southern coast. Cedric did not respond immediately. The name carried weight for both of them. the coordinator of her father's underground network, the man she had fed disinformation to during the most consequential operation of both their lives. And he will be tried, formally, publicly, the same process as every other conspirator. She paused. The pause contained something she had been carrying for months. Not guilt, not exactly, but the particular weight that accumulated inside a person who had performed an act of necessary destruction against something they once belonged to. He told Hadrian's people that he never suspected me, that he trusted my father's cipher and my father's blood, and never once considered the possibility that both could be turned against him. Does that bother you? It should. The fact that it does not is what bothers me. She looked at the lights below, thousands of individual points of warmth created by thousands of individual lives, each one operating inside a kingdom whose survival had been purchased through decisions that those lives would never fully understand. I destroyed the last thing my father built. I used his name and his network and his cipher to protect the man who executed him. And the part of me that should feel devastation about that is quiet, completely quiet, as though it decided somewhere between the first letter and the last transmission that survival required becoming someone my father would not recognize. And it made that decision without asking my permission. Kadric turned to face her. The fading light caught the silver threads that had appeared at his temples during the months of recovery. Not aging, exactly, but the physical record of a body that had processed more crisis than its biological timeline should have required. His gray eyes held hers with the particular intensity that had terrified every person in his kingdom for 14 years, but that she had never once experienced as threat. She experienced it as recognition. The sustained attention of a mind that processed the world through threat assessment, finally encountering something it categorized differently. Not safe, not harmless. Something more complex than either. A presence that his architecture had learned to integrate rather than defend against. Your father built a network designed to destroy what he feared. You used that network to protect what you chose. The difference between those two actions is the difference between reaction and agency. He paused. You did not become someone he would not recognize. You became someone he never had the opportunity to become. Because he died before the world forced him to choose between the person he was and the person circumstances required. Celine held his gaze for a duration that exceeded conversation and entered the territory where two people who had survived the same catastrophe acknowledged to each other that survival had changed them in ways that could not be reversed and should not be regretted. You sound almost wise, she said. It is deeply unsettling. Something happened to Kadric's face. The muscles around his mouth shifted in a configuration that his court would not have recognized and that Hadrian would have documented as a potential medical event. Not quite a smile. The structural precursor to a smile. The architectural preparation for an expression that his face had not produced in so many years that the relevant muscle groups required recalibration before they could execute it. Do not tell Hadrian. He will demand a medical evaluation. Celine's mouth performed a similar reconfiguration. Your secret is structurally sound. They stood together as the last light withdrew from the valley, and the capital below became a field of illumination against darkness, evidence of human persistence, of the stubborn refusal to accept that the night was permanent, of the fundamental drive to build something warm inside something cold, and defend it against everything trying to extinguish it. Kadric's hand moved from the railing and settled against the small of her back. Not possessively, not protectively. With the quiet certainty of a man who had finally learned the difference between holding something because you feared losing it and holding something because you had earned the right to stay close to it. Empires rose and collapsed across the continent. Dynasties burned through their own ambition. Kings died on thrones they inherited but never deserved. But the kingdom that survived, the one built on obsidian cliffs by a man who learned too late that invulnerability was a prison, and a woman who discovered too early that loyalty required the destruction of everything she came from. That kingdom endured. Not because its rulers were kind, not because they were merciful, because they understood, through scars earned in frozen forests and choices made in burning citadels, that the only power worth building was the kind that made room for the one person capable of telling you the truth about what you had become. And in a world built upon obedience, that was the most dangerous form of love that existed.